Welcome to The Explainer. So let's just dive right in. Today we're exploring a true literary masterpiece, E. M. Forster's A Passage to India. But we aren't just going to recap the plot here. We're going to peel back the layers of this book as if it were a palimpsest. You know, one of those ancient documents where multiple histories, writing styles, and personal motives have been written, erased, and then written over again. It's a brilliantly complex text, and it captures a very specific, volatile moment in history. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the motives for journey, the 5 styles of writing, how history collides with fiction, and finally, the novel as prophecy. To really get where Forster is coming from, we first have to understand his era. Back in the 19th century, British writers like Rudyard Kipling constantly framed voyages to India as this noble, civilizing mission, the so-called white man's burden to educate and manage wild peoples. But this highly romanticized narrative conveniently ignored the gritty reality, right? It ignored the massive political control and economic wealth that Britain was actually extracting from colonizing India. Forster was writing in the twilight of this empire, and he wanted to challenge those exact assumptions head-on.
So part 1, the motives for journey. You might not know this, but Forster actually lifted his title from Walt Whitman's poem, Passage to India. Now, Whitman's poem celebrated a highly romanticized, absolute mystical certainty. It was all about this grand design where the whole world is unified, but it completely glossed over the real-life issues of class, caste, gender, and politics on the ground. Forster brilliantly added a single letter to his title, the word A passage to India. By making it an indefinite article, he completely replaces Whitman's absolute certainty with a kind of modernist tentativeness. He's telling us there are multiple, equal ways to experience India, not just one superior route dictated by the author or the empire.
And this really illustrates how Forster judged the concept of empire itself. He basically evaluated 3 different eras of rule strictly by how they connected with the Indian spirit. First up is Babar, the founder of the Mughal dynasty. Forster actually admired him, not for his conquests, but because he connected with the core Indian value of renunciation, specifically the time Babar ceremonially sacrificed his own life so his 6th son might live. Next, we have the East India Company, which Forster totally condemned. He saw it as a greedy commercial venture built on unconscious deceit and hypocrisy that blocked any real creative thought. And finally, the British Crown. He found direct rule by the Crown to be incredibly sterile, officially apathetic, and completely disconnected from the daily realities of the people. The really crucial thing to remember here is that Forster's own motive for traveling to India was entirely personal, not official. He wasn't there to govern, trade, or convert anybody. His journey in 1912 was fueled by a deep friendship with Syed Ras Masood, who really woke Forster up to Indian culture and urged him to write a novel. Masood praised Forster for a very specific quality, taras. It's an Urdu word that translates to imaginative sympathy. It's this exact ability to physically feel the difficulties of another person that literally becomes the emotional engine of the novel.
Moving on to part 2, 5 styles of writing.
So Forster plays this amazing literary trick. He doesn't just use one single voice, he ships seamlessly between 5 distinct styles of writing to build his world. For instance, he uses a history textbook style to compare the British Raj to the ancient Mauryan Empire, basically pointing out that the Raj is just a temporary blip in a long history where everyday people always suffer under some ruling class. He also uses social comedy as a reality check, showing how beautiful trees hide the dirty realities of the bazaars from newly arrived British officials. Let's take a closer look at how the other 3 styles actually work on the page.
Take the opening. It reads almost exactly like a standard travel guide describing the town of Chandrapur, but Forster totally subverts tourist expectations here. Instead of pointing out grand architectural sites, he focuses on ineffective temples, dirt, and rubbish. He writes, "The very wood seems made of mud, the inhabitants of mud moving." He deliberately points us away from the typical tourist traps and steers our attention straight toward the obscure, mysterious Malabar caves 20 miles away.
But then he pivots. He contrasts that ugly, muddy reality with this beautiful, romantic landscape style. The writing suddenly becomes poetic and cosmic. He shows how the immense power of nature, especially the sky, can momentarily rise above all our petty human divisions of race and class, offering a sort of final benediction over the earth. And all of this ultimately crashes into the modernist quest style, which is entirely centered around those obscure Malabar caves. The caves represent a deeply frustrating, even terrifying psychological search for meaning. They throw logical order into pure chaos and defy any rational attempt to classify or explain them. It perfectly captures that modernist feeling of total alienation in an incomprehensible universe.
Because the writing is just so layered, literary critics today generally tackle the novel through three main lenses. The symbolic approach views elements like the caves as representing the terrifying primal unconscious. The linguistic approach really hones in on Forster's heavy use of negative words like nothing and scarcely, to argue that the empty spaces and gaps are what actually matter most in the text. And finally, colonial discourse analysis examines how race, class, and gender strictly dictate what the characters can and cannot see. All right, part 3. History collides with fiction. This is where the real world actually violently crashes into the writing process. Remember how we called this book a palimpsest? Well, that's because it was written across 12 years of explosive historical change. Forster started writing during his first visit in 1912, which was a period of relative political calm. In the novel, this era feels almost like a nostalgic golden age where apolitical friendships still seemed possible. But then World War I happened. He put the book aside and only finished it after his second visit in 1921. By then, the landscape was entirely defined by intense nationalistic uprisings, the non-cooperation movement, and the horrifying aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The ground had literally shifted beneath his feet. And you can see these real-world political tensions bleed right onto the page. When the character Dr. Aziz is arrested, we see subaltern protests, these marginalized groups rising up against injustice. The sweepers go on strike and paralyze the town's sanitation, and Muslim women in Purda swear to fast until Aziz is freed. The dynamic between the colonizer and the colonized in the novel permanently fractures, mirroring the exact historical reality of 1921. But that brings us to a really fascinating mystery. If Forster is putting all this 1921 political reality into his book, why on earth is Mahatma Gandhi, literally the most vital, unifying figure of the era, never once mentioned in the novel? Well, the sources point to a couple of reasons for this pretty glaring erasure. First, Forster spent his second trip working as a secretary in the princely state of Dewas. The rulers of those princely states actually feared and hated Gandhi because he represented a direct threat to their own deeply traditional aristocratic power. Second, Forster himself harbored some very mixed, anxious feelings about the nationalist struggle. At his core, he was a liberal humanist who valued personal, one-on-one relationships above all else, and he really struggled to fully wrap his head around the massive, collective political movements of his time. Finally, Part 4, the novel as prophecy. Let's zoom all the way out to the macro scale. The novel actually anticipates some massive geopolitical shifts. Characters explicitly predict the next European war, what would obviously become World War II, where England's difficulties might just become India's opportunity. But even more fascinating is how the novel explores the concept of the nation-state itself. Near the end, characters debate whether India will just adopt the messy, sort of outdated 19th century model of the nation-state, or whether India's deep spiritual traditions might allow it to skip that phase entirely and leap straight into a unified internationality, a global human community held together by devotion rather than borders. Which brings us to our final thought. Forster actually said himself that his book wasn't ultimately about politics. It was about something much wider. He challenges us with this question: is our ultimate goal simply a political nation-state, or are we all, across every race and class, simply searching for a more lasting home in a universe that is fundamentally incomprehensible to our minds? It's a profound question about humanity's search for belonging, and it's exactly what makes this novel worth decoding even a century later. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it leaves you wanting to explore the layers of your own favorite books.